spent years undercover as a money launderer to the international underworld, infiltrating the apex of a criminal hierarchy safeguarded by a circle of dirty bankers and businessmen who quietly shape power across the globe. They knew me as Bob Musella, a wealthy, mob-connected American businessman also living the good life. We partied in $1,000 per night hotel suites, lived in lavish homes. Bob Musella ran a successful investment company, had an interest in a Wall Street brokerage firm, operated a chain of jewelry stores. What they didn't know was that I wasn't really Bob Musella.
Former customs official Robert Mazur infiltrated a drug trafficking cartel at the beginning of the 80s. His story takes us into the heart of a world in a state of upheaval. At that time, the world of finance, in the throes of liberalization, was throwing off all banking regulations, and the demand for cocaine and heroin was going through the roof. The moment had come for criminal organizations to industrialize their economic model. As far as the banks were concerned, all money, criminal or not, was acceptable in the business of making money with money.
Miami seems to have become paradise lost.
There were 36 murders around unincorporated Dade.
In a bloody 24-hour stretch, both Dade County and the city of Miami set new homicide records.
Drugs and money, they go hand in hand in South Florida. Cocaine and marijuana sales through Miami generate so much money that smugglers literally...
At the start of the 80s, cocaine, the drug of choice for the wolves of Wall Street, flooded into America. Miami, the coastal city in Florida which had formerly been the stronghold of contraband liquor during Prohibition, became the main gateway for this massive illegal trade. The Colombian cartels had been the major winners in the gang wars and took control of this lucrative market, leaving a trail of corpses in its wake. But there was always the same problem: how to hide the money.
In sunny Florida, drug traffickers and money launderers were as plentiful as palm trees. To combat the problem, the IRS Intelligence Division partnered with U.S. Customs and a task force called Operation Greenback that went after drug money launderers.
The customs officer Robert Mazur went to Florida on a mission to infiltrate the Medellin cartel controlled by Pablo Escobar. Robert Mazur carefully crafted a new identity to enable him to reach the highest circles of organized crime.
I started walking around cemeteries, looking for a date of birth similar to mine. Then I got the birth certificate, which would be the basis of my new identity. I got a driving license, opened several bank accounts with checkbooks, savings, and credit card accounts. Once I'd created my profile, just needed to identify some targets.
After months of investigation, Robert Mazur, now known as Bob Musella, used an informer to make contact with a Colombian stockbroker who was close to the cartels, Gonzalo Mora. Robert Mazur went all out to woo him: trips in sports cars, high-class restaurants, flights by private jet. Gonzalo Mora was convinced that he was being introduced into high society and began to open up to him.
Mora didn't waste much time in talking to me about the BMPE, the black market pesos exchange. The money from the drugs trade was placed in dollars at a foreign exchange agency in Miami and converted into pesos via one of the many exchange agencies in Colombia.
In a further charm offensive, Robert Mazur dangled his international finance contacts in front of Gonzalo. Now the customs officer just needed to find the ideal establishment.
As I cruised down palm-lined Ashley Drive in downtown Tampa in a money green Mercedes 500 SEL provided by Customs, a building containing the upscale offices of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International caught my eye. BCCI in large gold letters glittered from the second story and screamed of overseas accounts. So I called an officer and scheduled an appointment. A few days later, in a private conference room of that building, the vice president of the Tampa branch was grilling me about my business history and background. I explained that my associates in Colombia required absolute discretion and intended to send me funds periodically to invest for them in Florida real estate. The VP agreed to open an account for me.
And he met with the bankers in Miami and said, "Hi there, I'm a drug dealer. I've got $1 zillion to launder. How can you help me?" And they said, "Welcome to the party. That's what we do for a living." And all of this case was beginning to develop.
Customs Officer Robert Mazur started to do business with BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. The Pakistani bank had a carefully crafted image with glossy brochures, luxury offices, and subsidiaries all over the world, creating a perfect facade. Robert Mazur didn't know at this stage that BCCI, newly arrived in the U.S., was a case study in fraudulent banking activity. So as to attract potential Colombian clients, the undercover agent studied the ins and outs of the bank's operations.
Today I am sitting before God and before you all like a child. The place of humility comes in what we call the technology of the invisible.
The founder and guiding light of the BCCI was a Pakistani financier, Agha Hassan Abedi. When the bank was first founded, it presented itself as a bank for the poor and for Muslims in what was then called the Third World.
It was difficult for people to do banking. The access to financial services was not always freely available to minorities, migrant communities, lower income, and in a lot of countries that couldn't get financing for trade and other activities very easily or in relatively good terms. So BCCI was meant to be a genuinely global bank that would serve the underserved.
Now, the way that bank was put together was really quite astonishing. Well, they created two corporations. One was incorporated in Cayman, and the other one was incorporated in Luxembourg.
Abedi founded BCCI in Luxembourg in 1972. The relatively recent tax haven had just adopted banking secrecy in order to revive its economy, which was under threat due to the decline of its mining industry. BCCI also established itself in the Cayman Islands. The chain of Paradise Islands, formerly a safe haven for pirates who went there to stash their treasure, is now a tax haven, a member of the Commonwealth, regulated by British banking laws, the ultimate gauge of stability for investors. The Cayman Islands also serve as a key hub for the cocaine trade, linking Colombia and Florida. The local authorities don't regulate currency exchange at all. Money deposited in dollars can be converted into pesos or Swiss francs, depending on where the money needs to hide. In 1975, in a mirror image of their Luxembourg operation, BCCI registered a new headquarters in the Caribbean tax haven.
And Luxembourg lent money to buy the shares in Cayman, and he had Cayman lend the money to buy the shares in Luxembourg. There are now assets in both banks, so they were off to the races.
Registering in tax havens was the first step. Now they needed to create entities in the world's biggest cities. BCCI opened its first offices simultaneously in Abu Dhabi, the hub for petrodollars at that time of oil crisis, and in London. But in the city, the lack of transparency of the financial background at BCCI worried the regulators, who refused to give it a full banking operating license. Never mind, Aga Hassan Abedi opened luxury offices a stone's throw from the Bank of England. BCCI's seal gleamed in the hallowed halls of finance.
They were one of the most aggressive banks in terms of lending to developing countries, in terms of expanding international banking, and in terms of developing international private banking for very, very wealthy individuals, including government officials. So the game was that they had all these petrodollars showing up in deposits. What are we going to do with them? Well, they just opened the doors to, anything that walked in terms of trafficking, in terms of drug dealing. He didn't really care what the sources of income were.
So this became a real monster.
At the end of the 70s, BCCI had 146 offices in 32 countries. It was one of the first to establish a presence in communist China. The great and the good were fascinated by the bank for the underserved. The chosen trophy target was former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, known for his activism on behalf of the Third World. At the beginning of the 80s, Abedi and Carter traveled to Africa together to finance humanitarian projects.
What was Abedi doing when he hauled Carter all over Africa? He was trying to get these various governments to allow him to have unlimited banking licenses. He was making contact with high officials so that if there were bribes to be paid or anything to be done in the country, it would be done through his bank. And he was also promoting this idea to create an aura of invulnerability, that this was the banker to the Third World.
So they looked like a very big success story.
At the beginning of the 80s, BCCI opened its first American agencies in Miami and Tampa. Florida could barely cope with the money laundering needs of the drugs trade. It was at that precise moment that the undercover agent Robert Mazur opened a first account at BCCI to draw in his Colombian clients. As predicted, his target, Gonzalo Mora, fell into the trap and gave up the jewel in his address book, a man with expensive tastes, a great fan of Chagall, who was respectfully called the jeweler, Roberto Alcaíno, one of Pablo Escobar's main money launderers.
Alcaíno had evaded U.S. Customs, the DEA, and the FBI. He was one of the main actors in the international drugs trade, and several investigations had unsuccessfully targeted him.
A meeting was set up at the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles.
When I arrived, Alcaíno wasted no time telling me who he was. He spoke English with a faint Chilean accent. His confidence filled the room, and he led the conversation as though he were conducting an orchestra. "So tell me, what do you do?" he asked me sharply. I walked him through my investment company, my costume jewelry chain, my brokerage firm. I told him I could push their dope profits through my mortgage company so that they could be returned to them as what looked like loan proceeds. It would not only bulletproof their financial affairs from the IRS, it would create camouflage for their real business.
A series of meals and private meetings helped to convince Roberto Alcaíno. The undercover agent Robert Mazur then opened a series of accounts at BCCI for the Medellin cartel. This is how the billions of dollars from the cocaine trade became mixed up with investments in Africa and with petrodollars in the Middle East. The first part was complete, and the undercover agent Robert Mazur had penetrated the drug money networks. On the other side of the Atlantic, a magistrate was trying to do the same thing, in reverse. At the beginning of the 80s, Sicily was in the throes of the worst mafia war in its history. Dead bodies were strewn through the streets of Palermo. The word mafia was whispered, but any investigations came to a dead end. Omerta reigned over Sicily, an island paralyzed by fear. A Palermo magistrate was on the verge of changing the destiny of Italy. Giovanni Falcone had been working on a corruption trial for several years. The city of Palermo, in the grip of a handful of developers, was an ugly concrete jungle. Giovanni Falcone targeted a highly visible entrepreneur, Rosario Spatola. This builder had the good fortune to own almost half the property market in the city and to be the biggest tax contributor in Sicily.
Rosario Spatola started off as a street vendor selling milk, so he was from quite a lowly background, and he got into trouble with the law because he even watered the milk down. And then suddenly, he was at the head of a construction company that was winning big contracts and earning enormous sums. And it raised questions about how he managed to climb so high, so quickly. And Falcone said that it was because there was a whole mafia network behind him, links to politicians which gave him access to public contracts and to the huge sums of public money that was being spent on the south of Italy.
In the scope of his investigation into Rosario Spatola, Giovanni Falcone, who specialized in compulsory liquidations, went to the Sicilian banks and went through everything, checks, debts, and transfers, with a fine-toothed comb. As he followed the money, Falcone came across a connection between the clans in Palermo, Spatola, and one of the Sicilian mafia families in New York, the bridgehead in the U.S. for the heroin trade.
I said to myself, look, if they've sold drugs in North America, they must have left traces of their dealings with the Sicilian banks. And that's what set me off on my first bank investigations.
He looked for checks that had been issued, money that had been deposited, money transfers. He followed the money so he could show there were irregular dealings and that this money was being moved around because it wasn't intrinsically linked solely to the construction sector, to a legal activity.
With help from the anti-mafia squad, Giovanni Falcone got together enough evidence at the end of 1982 to convict the developer Rosario Spatola and 70 members of his associates of money laundering for the mafia. Giovanni Falcone relied heavily on a new law that had recently entered the Italian statute books, the Piolatore law, a law that was written in blood. In March 1980, when the mafia war was at its height, a communist MP, Piolatore, submitted an anti-mafia law to the Italian parliament. On April 30, 1982, he was assassinated. The day after his death, General Dalla Chiesa, an anti-terror expert, was appointed prefect of Sicily. He was assassinated in turn on September 3rd. The country was gripped by fear, and politicians reacted to the public outcry. The Piolatore law was voted in on September 29, 1982. The word mafia entered into the Italian Penal Code, and Article 416 codified the offense of belonging to a mafia organization. Today, it still remains a unique legal mechanism in the world of law.
From September 29, 1982, we had a basic legal mechanism at our disposal which we hadn't had before and which allowed for a heavy sentence specifically linked to association with mafia-style criminals, but which also allowed us to hit the mafia where it hurts, namely, in their wallets. There was a real change in strategy by the Italian state with regard to its fight against the mafia.
The Piolatore law hit the mafia in Sicily financially, but the international financial networks of Cosa Nostra were unaffected. Giovanni Falcone turned to the American authorities and persuaded the FBI that transnational legal cooperation was the only way to hurt the mafia.
We went to the United States on numerous occasions. Falcone felt at home in America.
Falcone was a sort of superhighway linking the Italian and American justice systems against the mafia. Falcone gave a good impression of Italy. We had exported the mafia to America for over a century, but now Falcone was exporting anti-mafia methods.
And the Americans showed that they really appreciated this new collaboration. And they were really willing to help us because they realized that it was in their best interests of their own fight.
In New York, the Sicilian magistrate uncovered the famous Pizza Connection network, named after the pizzerias where heroin was dealt. As the months went by, the anti-mafia squad and the FBI discovered that the Sicilian-American mafia moved their money in 3 ways: simple bank transfers, via accounts managed by brokerage companies who sent the money towards shell companies abroad, and of course, in cash. Suitcases full of it were regularly transported on Swiss Air flights with the helpful assistance of some of the company's transit agents.
Drug trade equals money laundering. It's unthinkable that the profits from the sale of narcotics reach their beneficiaries through legal channels. These tasks are entrusted to international finance experts who put themselves at the service of organized crime in order to transfer their illegal profits to welcoming countries such as tax havens. It's always difficult to track down these operations. Money laundering consists of cleansing the capital of its illegal source, and that requires broad cooperation between countries.
That's when I started working on the mafia's money with Giovanni Falcone.
L'argent de la mafia.
At this stage, Carla Del Ponte wasn't yet a magistrate of the future International Criminal Court called on to judge crimes against humanity. She was a young prosecutor living in Tessin, the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, helping Giovanni Falcone to open doors to the Swiss banks, protected by banking secrecy laws.
Switzerland was a bit like the mafia's personal safe. They arrived in Switzerland sometimes with suitcases, and they made their deposits. No one asked them where the money came from, if it was dirty money or not. Not at all. It was just money, and money has no smell.
Pecunia non olet.
I asked the Swiss authorities if I could consult their documentation. Authorization was granted, but the 3 target accounts were immediately emptied. I continued my investigation and discovered that the money had been transferred to the account of a Panamanian company, which had divided the money between a bank in New York and one in Montreal. Then the dollars appeared in the account of a company based in Guernsey in Great Britain. And from there, they went back to Switzerland to a bank just next door to the first one. A new request for cooperation was sent to the Swiss authorities, which was once again authorized. Their incredible journey was finally ended by a Swiss prosecutor who decided to impound the funds.
I decided to block the money. He gave me the trail which helped me find the money. We managed to get the bank's cooperation because they didn't like negative publicity. And it was bound to get out at some point. So they said, we'll have to work with the legal authorities so that they didn't get caught with the money. In fact, they didn't want this money, even though they had enjoyed the benefits of it for many years.
Without the help of the magistrates and the Swiss authorities, I couldn't have carried out my instructions. Contrary to what you might think, Switzerland is one of the easiest countries to work with, because it realized that mafia money meant that sooner or later, it would end up with mafia types and mafia methods in their own country.
In Palermo, in his bunker under the courthouse, Giovanni Falcone was gathering together the pieces of an enormous jigsaw, one by one.
I remember Giovanni Falcone's office being literally covered in checks and copies of checks that he'd assembled. He was great at that. It wasn't the only thing he was good at, but that especially. Great at piecing together relationships and contacts which flowed from the movement of these bank checks. And it was one of the turning points linked to what is now commonly called the Falcone method.
The Falcone method, segui I soldi, or follow the money, is the key to the whole process. But Giovanni Falcone had an even more important insight. To his mind, it wasn't that there was a drugs mafia, a waste management mafia, extortion and prostitution. It was that the mafia operated as one single entity on an international level. One event was to prove him right. In 1983, Tommaso Buscetta, one of Cosa Nostra's men of honor and a major player in the drugs trade between Europe and America, was arrested in Brazil.
I met Buscetta for the first time in Brazil. He'd just been arrested. The boss of two worlds gave evasive answers to the questions my Brazilian colleague asked him. Then he said to me, "Your Honor, I would need more than one night to answer your questions." Then Buscetta said to me quite frankly, "I don't think that the Italian state really intends to fight the mafia. And I'm warning you, Your Honor, that you'll doubtless become famous after interrogating me. But they'll try to destroy you physically, and they'll do the same to me. Don't forget that the account you're opening with Cosa Nostra, you can't ever close it again. Do you still want to question me?"
In July 1984, Tommaso Buscetta arrived at Palermo Airport in handcuffs. He would be questioned by Falcone for 45 days straight and would give him the missing pieces of the jigsaw.
Buscetta provided us with a comprehensive account of the Mafia's organizational structure. He explained the territorial divisions within the families, the hierarchical setup, and the committee overseeing Cosa Nostra's illicit operations. His revelations essentially tore down the notorious wall of Omerta, shedding light on the true nature of the organization.
Tommaso Buscetta was soon joined by other repentant criminals. Their revelations were really helpful. The money the mafia had accumulated was more than anyone could imagine. Cosa Nostra had never been so wealthy. In the United States, the customs official Robert Mazur noticed that the Colombian cartels had also increased their operations to an industrial scale.
In one of our meetings, Roberto Alcaino talked about their New York operations and launched into the numbers. Some of the big boys are coming here with 3,000 units, kilos of coke, every 10 days, so let's say 9,000 units per month, around 50 tons a year. You're talking over $600, $700 million a year. So when you're talking about a profit of 40% from $600 million, you're talking about $240 million a year profit.
$240 million in 1980 is roughly $900 million in today's money, just for the New York area. The income from the drugs trade was so high that there was always a need to find new ways of disposing of the money. Robert Mazur reported back to Alcaino what he had discussed with the director of the BCCI in Tampa, Florida.
The director said to me, "In the past, we've often helped clients transfer their funds to our subsidiary in Grand Cayman, but I don't recommend that anymore because there's been a treaty with the American tax authorities which allows Washington to obtain our bank statements. Now, we recommend that our clients place their money where the United States can't track it, in our new subsidiary in Panama."
Roberto Alcaino understood that having an American nominee in Panama to move the drug money around was a big advantage and a guarantee of invisibility. What's more, Panama was a country where the Colombian cartels already had a powerful logistical platform for moving cocaine to the United States. Geography and history would appear to prove Roberto Alcaino correct. Panama shares a border with Colombia, and its canal links the Pacific and the Atlantic. It's also a key commercial gateway and a strategic pivot in power relations between the United States and Latin America.
Panama was a creation of Wall Street and American business. End of story. Panama was part of Colombia. Panama's independence was declared in New York 2 days before it happened.
Since independence in 1903, all foreign depositors were exempt from tax under Panama's banking laws, which had been dreamt up by attorneys on Wall Street. In Panama City, there was no control over financial transactions. The cornerstone of this system was Panama's strongman leader, former head of the Secret Service, General Manuel Noriega. Noriega had a finger in every pie. He was an ally of Washington in the fight against communist subversion in Latin America, a man who secretly worked for the CIA. He was also a man who had worked for several years hand in hand with the Medellin cartel. When the Reagan administration launched its great crusade, its war on drugs in the mid-'80s, Noriega was on the horns of a dilemma. He passed information to the DEA, the American Drug Agency, but in his own unique way.
On the one hand, he's telling the U.S., look at me, I'm going to help you with the drug traffickers. On the flip side, he's, in effect, helping the drug traffickers, and so it went.
Noriega only informed the DEA about the enemies of the Medellin cartel. He encouraged Pablo Escobar to set up shell companies in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, and to take out major shareholdings in 2 Panamanian banks. In Panama, Noriega's wealth and that of the Medellin cartel didn't go unnoticed by the BCCI.
BCCI were among many banks that were pursuing Manuel Noriega as a client. He was someone who was working with the United States. Panama was an ally of the United States. Having a head of state's account is in fact a positive achievement from the point of view of the bank.
Came a moment when Panama got into trouble because they were repatriating too much money to the U.S. So we were told that there was a meeting of the Panamanian bankers who wanted to figure out what to do about all of this cash that was flooding into the country so they could still do business with the Federal Reserve. And what they concluded was they had to sell the currency to the Swiss. And once a week, there was a cargo flight from Panama City to Zurich loaded with American dollars coming from the drug traffickers in Panama.
But Noriega was too important to the Americans and was untouchable. In the last years of the Cold War, neighboring Nicaragua joined Cuba in the socialist camp. Ronald Reagan's America wanted to liquidate this regime at all costs. So the CIA secretly financed the counter-revolutionary guerrillas, the Contras. Noriega put his networks at the disposal of American intelligence.
He cuts a deal with American intelligence people to be the supplier to the Contras. He's going to send them arms and ammunition, even though it's prohibited under U.S. law. He's going to take care of it. The bad news is he was also selling arms to the government. So he's supplying both sides of the Civil War.
Noriega was systematically engaging in a double game, convinced that the Americans wouldn't take action against him. And with good reason, because the drug transportation networks were the same networks through which the CIA was arming the Contras in Nicaragua.
God knows how much in the way of cash in, coke out, arms in, arms out. It was a center for every form of illegal business you can imagine.
That is where also BCCI shows up as one of the banks that were used to finance this, and the money would be laundered through the system of jurisdictions that would not open their books very easily or at all, in order for the money to end up supporting the Contras.
By helping to support the Nicaraguan Contras, the BCCI believed it had acquired respectability in the eyes of the Americans. And in further good news, the BCCI obtained a full banking operating license in the United Kingdom. Aga Hassan Abedi was riding the crest of a wave and enjoyed international recognition. In Italy, the invisible world was about to be dragged from the shadows and into the spotlight. In February 1986, the maxi trial of Cosa Nostra began in Palermo. After 3 years of investigation involving coordination with Switzerland and the United States, the anti-mafia squad had drawn up an indictment 8,000 pages long. The courtroom was an anti-missile bunker constructed within the prison. 475 mafiosi were behind bars. Tommaso Buscetta, whose family had been decimated by the Corleone clan, was in the witness box for several days without a break. The mafioso also appeared in the other big Cosa Nostra trial, the Pizza Connection trial in New York. After 17 months of hearings, it was established that the mafia had imported heroin to the value of $1.6 billion into the United States. After these lengthy trials, Switzerland also followed suit.
We had the Pizza Connection trial in Lugano, which was in fact one of the most difficult trials because we didn't have enough of a legal basis for linking the money to drugs. By that, I mean the responsibility of the fiduciaries, or those that take care of all that money. We still managed, in part, to get convictions. But it was one of the hardest trials I've ever known, to try to establish the legal arguments for money laundering.
This unusual alliance between European and American judges resulted in an historic vote in 1986 when Congress passed a law declaring drug money laundering a federal crime.
We were able to confiscate the money, but above all, it enabled us to convict the suspects who managed this money, who were responsible for it. This was an extremely important aspect.
This financial trail ended up with the criminalization of money laundering, the 86 law in the United States, and then the adoption of a similar policy from 88 onwards by the majority of OECD countries. We realized that tracking this money, this dirty money, was in effect a way of hitting the criminal organizations financially. But that also implied ending banking secrecy and convincing the tax havens that while their activities were legal in terms of their own sovereignty, they were also a channel for dirty money or activities at the very outer limit between legal and illegal activity. Where does tax optimization end and tax evasion begin? Just as we were putting anti-money laundering policies in place, there was a big increase in techniques that enabled this money laundering.
There was an explanation for the big increase in money laundering: financial deregulation. On October 27, 1986, the London Stock Exchange launched the financial Big Bang. The market was totally computerized. The movement of capital was more liberalized than ever before. Foreign financial establishments were now authorized to trade in securities in the city. the world was changing from industrial capitalism to financial capitalism, in which banks and markets would move huge sums of money disproportionate to the real economy. This shift towards deregulation was the biggest ever seen in modern history and was the legacy Margaret Thatcher left to the world. The major financial centers of the world, London, Tokyo, New York, and Hong Kong, were permanently connected, and the stock exchange would never sleep again. Ronald Reagan was not to be outdone. He accelerated deregulation by giving foreign investors access to U.S. Treasury bonds. These bonds became the secure asset of the entire world. As they could be traded without risk at any time, these Treasury bonds acted as an international currency for anyone who held them. The Thatcher-Reagan financial revolution benefited one major criminal organization at the heart of the banking system of the only country in the world where money seemed to print itself, the economic miracle that was Japan. In the mid-80s, Japan's success was admired and feared in equal measure. Japan was a country of savers and was the world's premier creditor country. 7 of the world's largest banks were Japanese, and the largest of those, Nomura, was bigger than the top 5 American banks. Japan cornered the market in technological innovation, economic performance, banking power, and social cohesion. But, as with everything, there was a downside to this, which was excessiveness. On May 5, 1986, the Anagawa-kai, one of the main branches of Yakuza, the Japanese Mafia, appointed as its chief an elderly man who had just been released from prison, Hishi Susumu. The ceremony was attended by politicians, TV stars, bankers, the bosses of big businesses, as well as by the main Yakuza families. At the height of the period of financial deregulation, a wave of property speculation swept over Japan, and the Yakuza fully intended to benefit from the resulting property bubble.
Ishi Susumu is credited as being the father of the modern-day Yakuza, or of the Keizai Yakuza. Keizai Yakuza means economic, the economic Yakuza. He's the one who said, from now on, every Yakuza needs to get up in the morning and read the financial newspapers. The stuff about the Yakuza being samurai or ninja or firefighters, I think, is mostly bullshit. They've always been businesses, and they've always been businesses about helping themselves.
In the midst of the speculative bubble that had Japan in its grip, the Yakuza chief, Hishi Susumu, invested heavily in property, in big companies listed on the stock exchange like Nippon Steel, and in a whole host of companies in Japan and abroad.
Ishi Susumu was a gambler. I mean, he spent his whole life as a gambler. He once said, the Japanese stock market is like a casino, and if we wanted to, we could be the house, and the house always wins.
The term Yakuza means a losing hand in a game of chance. The Yakuza originated from long lines of thieves and foreign minorities that were marginalized as street vendors and members of gambling dens. The Yakuza had always been close to power and had established themselves since the end of the war as a pro-fascist nationalist militia at the emperor's right hand.
The Yakuza provide money and support to create Japan's leading political party. And the Yakuza, of course, help out the Liberal Democratic Party because the Liberal Democratic Party had a tacit agreement that we'll leave you alone. We won't have a crackdown on you. We won't have organized crime laws.
The Yakuza have their place in society. They had their names on office doors. They published their own magazines. They were sort of an above ground underground.
Their revenue streams are construction, extortion, blackmail, bid rigging, real estate, evicting people from their property, fraud, and drugs.
Hishi Susumu was the head of the Inagawa-kai, which had more than 10,000 members, and he used this to pressurize Nomura Bank to vouch for him in the world of business. In less than 5 years, the Yakuza boss had amassed an estimated fortune of $4 billion. He considered himself one of the leading lights of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. He was now the Zytec Yakuza, the mafia financial wizard.
Yakuza pay taxes. And, you know, the fact that that revenue may be legal or illegal, the tax agency is like, well, we get our taxes. They haven't violated the tax laws. I mean, that's crazy, but that's how it is in Japan. So, well, you don't need to launder your money. You just need to put it in the company bank account. Or if your company bank account is, you know, so suspect, you just funnel it to another. Like Citibank got their asses kicked by the Financial Services Agency several times. They just didn't care. For many years, Japanese banks knew that their customers were Yakuza. I mean, you know, Yakuza bosses, and they don't care.
They were speculating at the highest levels of Japanese investment. They were part of the high-tech companies emerging in Japan. They became a source of capital for other Japanese companies. And this is from an industry of loan sharks. You have to understand what's happening here. The Chamber of Commerce of Japan was becoming increasingly criminalized.
As the National Police Agency said, the Yakuza have infiltrated the stock markets, financial markets of Japan so much that it threatens the very basic economic foundations of our country.
You know, organized crime is parasitical. It is not a force of production. It is taking away from production. It acts as an invisible tax.
Susumu invested in Macau, Hong Kong, and South Korea. The mafia boss organized business trips in Latin America, stopped off at the Carnival in Rio, and was granted an audience with Manuel Noriega in Panama.
He had wonderful political relations. The Inagawa Kai did businesses with the Bush family.
At the end of the 80s, Susumu alone accounted for a quarter of the entire wealth accumulated by the Yakuza syndicates. But during a trip to Mexico in 1991, 2 dark clouds appeared. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and when he returned to Japan, confined to a wheelchair, the property bubble burst. At the same time, one event would be responsible for the loss of BCCI and its figurehead, Aga Hassan Abedi. At the end of the 80s, the biggest political scandal of the Reagan years erupted, Irangate. A senior officer of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard revealed to a Libyan newspaper how arms were being sold by Washington to Iran to finance the Contras in Nicaragua. Congress immediately opened an investigation. The attorney Jack Bloom was in charge of this investigation, and he discovered in the piles of seized documents and confidential reports evidence linking Manuel Noriega and the BCCI.
There was, in the end, a seizure of an incredible treasure trove of documents relating to the bank's activities. And it was such a massive treasure trove that nobody could actually mine the whole thing to figure out all of the different criminal things that had gone on.
The congressional inquiry was then entrusted to the New York prosecutor, Robert Morgenthau, son of Henry Morgenthau, one of the architects of the Glass-Steagall Act.
New York is the financial capital of the world. On a quiet day, $3.5 trillion goes through here. So it's a natural place to launder drug money because you can put 10, 20, $30 million into that stream, and it doesn't even make a blip on the computer screen.
The inquiry into BCCI gave Robert Morgenthau a major problem. The Republican administration was doing everything it could to sweep the affair under the carpet. But Morgenthau had an ace in his hand. Robert Mazur's undercover operation was reaching its conclusion. In Florida, the customs officer's work was about to result in an historic haul. Robert Mazur had become very close to members of the Medellin cartel and the bosses of the BCCI, and when he organized his fake wedding, he naturally invited all his new friends.
In the billowing white canopy of a tent on the lawn, a scarlet carpet divided 250 chairs, leading to an altar decorated with roses from Colombia. Dozens of Boston ferns sat atop the Greek columns, offering privacy for the ceremony. Dozens of condos laid in wait, stocked with wine and spirits, all on the government's tab. Around 50 American agents were among the guests, posing as friends and family members.
The net was closing in. During the ceremony, all the guests were arrested. Among them, Roberto Alcaíno, Pablo Escobar's money launderer, as well as 9 senior managers of the BCCI. It was the first big money laundering scandal since the introduction of the law in 1986. Robert Morgenthau was able to make use of this spectacular raid to close the BCCI file. In July 1991, the bank was officially shut down, a major first in the history of finance.
So on Friday afternoon, after the closure of the markets, the Bank of England, Federal Reserve, the Institut Monétaire Luxembourgeois took a coordinated action and closed BCCI globally.
The BCCI left behind a debt of $20 billion. Its bankruptcy resulted in more than 3,000 legal proceedings throughout the world.
BCCI tells you something about how the world works. It became a mirror of global evil. It showed us how the good and the bad, the big business and the small, intelligence services, crooks, kleptocrats, legitimate organizations, businesses, all interfaced, interacted in this world. But what it tells you is that many others are contributing. And we haven't touched them, we have not investigated them. By simply going after one facilitator and taking out only some of the responsible players, because some of the big players did not have to answer for what they did.
Following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Manuel Noriega went from being a major player in the Cold War to being somewhat of an embarrassment for the United States, a relic from another era. It was time to get rid of him. Noriega was reduced to silence and kept the BCCI's secrets. But the bank harbored further secrets still.
It was a CIA bank, it was a KGB bank, it was a Mossad bank, it was an Iranian bank, it was, you name it, everybody discovered that this was a very useful tool because, boy, they'd do anything for you and all you had to do was ask and pay the fee.
The BCCI played a major role in Secret Service operations throughout the Cold War. And as the congressional inquiry started by Jack Bloom revealed, one of the main actors miraculously managed to slip through the net. Kamal Adam, the architect of the Saudi Secret Services, had been involved in vast criminal networks since the creation of the BCCI. Kamal Adam was for a long time in the service of the CIA, and being well connected in Washington, was able to organize the BCCI's purchase of an American bank. He was also a major shareholder in a London-based company that laundered money for the Colombian cartels. The CIA intended to protect this man who had the ear of the major leaders in the Middle East, in the same way they protected anyone who was working in the interest of the Americans. During the inquiry into the BCCI, Kamal Adam was never troubled by the authorities. To go after him would be to go against the national interest.
So not full justice was done even in this case. But by removing BCCI, by removing some of the players that contributed to this, we simply smashed the mirror that we were looking into it. It gave us the impression that the evil disappeared, but all we did was we broke the mirror that was telling us about it.
I returned home. I'd changed. My marriage had suffered. My children didn't recognize me. A few weeks earlier, in Regine's in Miami, my BCCI contact, who drunk quite a lot of scotch, asked me, "Bob, do you know who the biggest money launderer in the United States is?" "Who?" I shrugged, smiling. "The Federal Reserve Bank. They know that in Colombia, any citizen can exchange their US dollars for Colombian pesos, no questions asked. The people at the Federal Reserve see this river of hundreds of millions in US dollars being shipped to them from Colombia. They know what generates that cash. The Federal Reserve takes that because it's good economics for this country's banking system. The American so-called war on drugs is a sham." I was floored. Later research confirmed my BCCI contact's claim, and I had never felt more betrayed. If this was true, why were we risking our lives?
In Japan, after the financial bubble burst, speculative euphoria gave way to recession and to a less rosy future. Hundreds of billions of yen had evaporated. Losses were estimated at 16% of national wealth, the same amount that it had cost Japan to rebuild after the war. The Yakuza were held responsible for this crisis due to their exploitation of the Japanese financial system. In 1991, an anti-Yakuza law was enacted. Every branch was identified, region by region. The idea was to ostracize them from society. From then onwards, it became necessary to certify that you weren't a Yakuza in order to live your daily life. The bell had tolled, and the godfather of godfathers, Hishi Susumu, died a ruined man. In Sicily, the long judicial process arrived at its conclusion. In 1992, the appeal court confirmed the convictions. Cosa Nostra decided that its pact with its allies in the heart of the Italian state was at an end. Salvatore Lima, the mayor of Palermo, the vital link between Cosa Nostra and his Christian Democrat Party, was gunned down in the street.
Ci si è chiesti in queste ultime ore, ma c'è ancora speranza per Palermo? Lei poc'anzi diceva che non serve fare dell'antimafia superficiale di facciata.
Ma certamente che c'è speranza. La mafia non è affatto invincibile, è un fatto umano e come tutti i fatti umani ha un inizio e avrà anche una fine.
Giovanni Falcone changed my life on 2 occasions. He changed my life when he came into it. He also changed it when he left it. Even today, I still really miss him.
On May 23, 1992, Giovanni Falcone was assassinated. Two months later, on July 19th, the judge Paolo Borsellino was also assassinated.
Giovanni Falcone was just 53 years old. Paolo Borsellino, 52. They were young. They could have done so much more for us. But the Mafia decided that the time had come to silence them. And they were silenced.
People usually die because they're on their own, or because they've bitten off more than they could chew. They often die because the right partnerships aren't in place, because there isn't enough support. In Sicily, the Mafia goes after public servants that the state doesn't succeed in protecting.
The arrest of one of Cosa Nostra's bosses, Toto Riina, in 1993 signaled the end of the all-powerfulness of the Mafia on the island. Giovanni Falcone and the anti-Mafia squad had given Italy a bit of respite. The end of the Cold War also brought hope of a new world. A hope that was to be short-lived. Faced with the creation of a new world order, the major powers went for the easy choice of globalization. Russia and China were intent on preserving their spheres of influence, and in order to counter American power, they would have to create a strategy of unprecedented alliances. For criminal organizations, this meant the opening up of new territories and new markets. In the numerous financial transactions occurring in a millisecond, dirty money would become harder than ever to trace. The banks, the main players in moving money about, would become the servants of shady finance. The era of white-collar organized crime had begun.